Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hi there.
Hi there.
How are you?
I'm okay, but I'm mostly curious about what this gorgeous beverage is we've got. You've got it in the crystal glasses, and it looks, for all the world, like a perfect canary diamond. It's so gorgeous.
It is pretty gorgeous, actually. This is the first time I've made this cocktail. Found it on my current favorite website, Difford's Guide. It is kind of a twist on a martini.
Okay.
It has the very boring name, the Ford Cocktail, so we need to come up with a better name.
Okay.
But it is from a book from 1895 called Modern American Drinks, How to Mix and Serve All Kinds of Cups and Drinks.
Aw.
I know,
Isn't that
I know.
the sweetest name?
Yeah, so let's taste it and then I'll tell you what's in it.
Okay. Yeah, what is it?
Okay, so it's Heyman's Old Tom Gin.
Okay.
Something we don't usually have in our cupboard, but we were playing around with cocktails last week for Thanksgiving and had picked up a bottle of it, and I thought, let's play with it. It's a sweeter gin. Mm-hmm. It has dry vermouth.
Okay.
And it has Benedictine, which we also haven't had recently, but we have right now.
Okay.
And then orange bitters.
I like it.
Yeah, it's kind of sweet, kind of dry.
And the Benedictine and the dry vermouth give it an herbal thing.
Yeah, and it does have that pretty kind of
God, the color
translucent yellow gold
It's so beautiful.
color. It's really pretty.
Maybe next time we make it, like, in an hour, we could grate some orange peel into it to kind of heighten that scent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, bringing the scent in would be nice.
Cool. What are we talking about now that you've made us this gorgeous diamond cocktail?
Sure. We are talking about how to recognize God's voice. There is a banner hanging in the back of the church where we've been meeting on Sunday nights that says something about how does God speak or where does God speak or something like that. And one of our attendees mentioned that might be something good for you to talk about on the podcast. And so I gave it a little thought.
Okay.
And I think the broader subject is, I think we recognize, and hopefully listeners, you do too, that God speaks and moves in mysterious ways. But the thing that is kind of important for us is to learn how to recognize when it's God's voice that we hear and not something else.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm more than happy to talk about it because it is an interesting question. But I wonder whether people believe that God speaks. I wonder whether any of our listeners, just because of the background they've had and people who have said they've been spoken to by God and now had to share the message of hate for everybody.
Right.
I wonder whether they think God speaks at all. And if so, not even just how one would know God is speaking to oneself, but also how to determine whether somebody else has had God speak to them.
That's a good one right there.
Like how do you separate the actual prophets from the, pretenders?
Yeah.
Right? Or just the people who hear their own egos or their own fears as if it were the voice of God.
Right.
Right? And I mean, that's part of the problem of discerning God's voice, but it's also like discerning spirits, right? Like, is that the right phrase?
Yeah, I think
something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but where you're trying to decide what it is you're hearing from somebody else as well.
Right.
Right? So it's a complicated piece. It's more complicated than just, am I hearing God? And is God still speaking? Or did God ever speak? Or can God? Any of those things.
Right.
But also, what about the guy down the street who said that God told him that I should feel this, that, or the other?
Right.
Does that sound right in terms of the parameters of this question?
I think so. I know over the years I've heard the question posed, how do I know when it's God's voice? Like, if you've been praying about something, praying about a direction, a new job, or a move, or whatever, and you're feeling a tug in a certain direction, how do I know what that is? Is that God? Is that my gut? Is that some combination of God working with my gut? I mean, I don't know. But I've heard that question posed before, like when I have a decision to make and I'm hearing conflicted ideas, or even just in my head, I'm hearing like all the pros and cons, I'm weighing them all the time. How do I know where God is in all of that?
Right. Okay. Well, let's start from if you're hearing the voice outside your head and there's nobody in the room, first you call your therapist rather than calling your priest. Okay. And probably a psychiatrist. And you might just kind of want to wander right down to the hospital. Just take a little meander.
Right.
And I'm only half kidding about that. I used to pastor a man whom I loved very much, elder, who was bipolar. And when he would go into a manic episode, he would hear God, right? Or interpret his hearing of God. And he would ask me when he was no longer in that phase, do you think I heard God? And my response had to be, I don't know whether you heard God or not, right? But quite seriously, if you hear a voice outside your head and there's nobody there, you should probably pay attention to that. So then the question is, how does God speak to us? Now, throughout the Bible, there's lots of different ways, right?
Yeah.
There's angels showing up. There's voices. It's not obvious whether the voice is coming from the burning bush or surrounding the burning bush, but there's a voice and there's a burning bush. So we've got that.
Right.
What else do we have? We have just voices, right? And so people hear God appearing to come from outside of them. We get a lot of God talking to people through dreams.
Yes.
Even in the Bible, there are lots of different ways that people have been spoken to by God.
Yes.
So God doesn't pick one particular way.
Right.
Okay. And since we've already determined that God meets us where we are, part of what we're learning to do when we are learning to listen for God's voice is to understand that God's voice may come to us differently than someone else. And that God's manner of speaking might be different than it would be for someone else.
Right.
When listener Jeanette asked about humor in the Bible, it made me think of the fact that God has spoken to me loudly more than once in terms of making me see something humorous in a situation.
Oh, wow.
And I've known it was God because I would be really stuck in my own emotions and my own feelings about a situation. And suddenly I would not hear, but hear in my heart a voice not exactly like mine, kind of saying something like, look over there. And it just turned my entire way of seeing the thing around.
Oh, wow.
And I would have to laugh, right? So I know from experience that God has worked with me with humor, for example.
Yes.
I think that part of learning to distinguish God's voice from other voices is to practice.
Yeah.
Right? The more time you spend in God's presence without a lot of distraction, without anything else, the more you start to hear and recognize God's voice.
Yeah.
And once you've got a decent interpretation of the Bible where you're not just reading it as, lessons to be practiced, then you can also start distinguishing God's voice in that. But you need to kind of have a sense of the entire Bible. Because if you're only hearing a voice that sounds like God mad at the people who built the calf, or you're only hearing a voice that says, don't condemn anyone, you're probably not hearing all of God.
Yeah.
So part of learning God's voice is to notice the way God speaks through other things, through the Bible, through other inspired books, through music, through the voice of creation, right? All of those things.
Right.
You start to learn what God's voice sounds like, and then it's easier to recognize it.
And also, I think sometimes the content of what you're hearing, because if the voice that you're hearing is saying something that would be inconsistent with God's nature, God's character, then that's not God. And the only way you're really going to know that, again, is spending time with God.
Yep.
And having spent some time with the Bible to learn sort of how God operates and who God is. Right. I think that's important too. It would be like if somebody said, yeah, well, your best friend said this, and you're like, no, they wouldn't say that. That's not a thing.
That doesn't sound like that.
That wouldn't happen, right? So it's kind of like that.
Very much like that. If you notice, when God speaks in the Bible to people, with very few exceptions, and there's very few exceptions, God is either direct or serious or beckoning or a little silly. So there's the whole thing with Jonah, where when God talks to Jonah, God is absolutely poking fun at Jonah.
Yeah.
Okay. But God never is anxious.
True.
God is never, oh my gosh, if you don't do this, it will never get done.
Right.
God is almost never, now you should go tell your neighbor just how awful they are and how superior you are. Again, Jonah comes to mind, but then that all gets turned around, right? God is direct. God is humorous. God is at ease in God's self. God absolutely trusts that what God is telling you is something you can do.
True. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether you believe it or not.
Yeah.
I do not believe, and I have not done my research on this, but I do not believe at any point God says to an individual, go convert the heathens.
No.
We get Paul talking about conversion, but he's talking about converting the heart, which is different than getting people to say magic words about Jesus. For example, when God speaks to the Jewish people, it's about living themselves to a code of behavior and distinguishing themselves from people who live in a way that is more life-destroying.
Yeah.
When God talks to people in the New Testament, there's not that much of it, right? But when God talks to people in the New Testament, Jesus is the best example. It's always about decency, kindness, not about judging other people, not about all of this kind of stuff. So that's part of that content thing, right? Test it against what you already know.
Right.
Now, the danger in that is if you think that God is just a horrible, horrible human being, then when God tells you to do something that's being awful to other people, it's going to sound like God.
That's true. So the God you're getting to know isn't actually God.
Yeah. So there's some of that, I think.
Right.
Have you had experiences that you would now look at as hearing from God or getting a sign from God, even if you didn't hear, Benton?
No, I don't think so. I do think that God has revealed God's will to me in ways that aren't a voice. And two, I think in my own personal time with God, one of the things that I often pray for is discernment / clarity / vision / wisdom, although wisdom is something you cultivate, so it's not really, God doesn't generally go boom and you're a wise person. But discernment, clarity, vision, help clear the fog so that I can understand what I'm looking at, so that I'm making a choice that's in harmony with you, in harmony with my world.
Yes.
Because sometimes when I pray that prayer, I feel like God sometimes makes me aware of perspectives or potential benefits / consequences of whatever this choice is. In other words, I might not think about how this is going to affect my mom until I think about how it's going to affect my mom. And it's like, oh, wait, I didn't see that. Sometimes I think that if you are really in a posture of, open my eyes that I may see, open my ears that I may hear, sometimes God will do that and help you see things more clearly than maybe you would otherwise, especially if you're in the middle of making a decision and all the pros and the cons and you're not, for me, a bazillion voices that are all my voices that are all telling me this, this, and this, and this. And so a lot of times that's more about like calming our own anxiety and giving us a sense of peace so that we're seeing things without all that crazy frenzied distraction, I think that sometimes God reveals God's self and God's will to us when we get away from the distraction. I mean, that's what Jesus did.
Yep.
Jesus got off by himself, got silent, got quiet, away from the crowds, away from the disciples, away from everybody. And I feel like that is something that's a practice that we can learn from Jesus that will help us discern when we are trying to figure out, is this God telling me this, or is this just me or my ego or something somebody wants from me or whatever?
I'm so glad you used the word practice, because if you're not in the habit of praying, being in the presence of God, listening for God, you're not going to necessarily recognize God's voice when you hear it.
Right.
You would recognize my voice. a random person in Korea would not recognize it was me.
Right.
That's not they're doing anything wrong. It's just how would they know?
Right.
Right. It's about spending enough time with this person to start recognizing their voice.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Dallas Willard wrote a book on this that is really, I've read a lot of Dallas Willard in my life. But I think Hearing God, which I think may have been his first or second book, it's really good about the practice and the tone of God's voice, like how you go about this and what God's tone is. I like that you mentioned that when God has worked with you, it's been more of an indication, more of a guidance.
Right.
One of the exercises I used to give my church for learning to listen for God's voice was to pay attention if you noticed some need and felt like you wanted to tend to it. A simple example might be something like, you walk by every beggar outside, I'm using that word deliberately, you walk by every beggar outside Safeway, but for some reason this particular person draws your attention.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Yeah.
And then you go into the store and you brush the person off just because you're used to brushing them off, but then you feel kind of pulled to go back. Go back. Because that is likely the Holy Spirit just going, psst, look over there. Practicing those kinds of things can be very helpful. You used to carry around ones, I believe, to give to people. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. At my coffee shop job, I get paid tips in cash. And generally those tips are for comic books and just carrying around money. And so I tend to keep some of that cash in my pocket all the time so that and it's generally small bills, so that when I do encounter somebody, I have some cash for that purpose.
Right. There's something about preparing for that moment of generosity, that moment of guidance, which is kind of like practicing hearing God. Right? You're preparing to change what you're doing at that moment.
Yeah.
Because you're pulled that way.
Right.
When we lived in our old house, particularly when we first moved, you may remember my dragging everybody out to look at sunsets and moons. And very often I felt that like a tug from God. Not just, oh, Elane, go look at that or notice that, but your people need this.
Yeah.
Go grab them.
Yeah.
You know? It was always, it wasn't, go do it, Elane. It was more like, wait, what? Oh, okay, yeah, I'll go do that. That kind of response.
Yeah, so it's almost like a more of a nudge or hey, over here. More than a bullhorn saying, pay attention to this.
Well, and at least for me, it's almost always something I wouldn't have just thought of at that moment. If I'm in the middle of cooking or whatever, and somebody says, hey, go look at the moon, I'd say, back off. Right? So if I notice it, that means it's probably not my normal way of doing things.
Yeah.
But going back to how you recognize it in other people, I think in general, human beings are inclined to make God a lot like us. So if somebody is basically a little proud, a little loud, or a little manipulative, or wants to be seen, any of those things, and also says, God is telling me to do this thing that would enable them to be all those things, I might want to question it.
Right.
There used to be a teacher in Ojai named Krishnamurti. Obviously not Christian, but very gentle, very charismatic without having any charisma at all. But somebody that people just wanted to sit and listen to.
Yeah.
And never told us to do anything specific. But gave a sense of what the world beyond our immediate perception was like. And fostered a sense of connection with other human beings, with the world, with God, and so forth. I think God spoke through Krishnamurti. I don't think God said, hey, say this sentence. But I think that Krishnamurti was in touch with God somehow and was expressing it as well as he could.
Yeah.
Those people.
Right.
C.S. Lewis, I
Yes.
think, was in touch with God.
Yeah.
Not always.
Yeah.
But there are moments when in his writing he says something that you just go, wow. Right? I think Einstein was in touch with God.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think God speaks exclusively through people who think or look or sound like us.
No, not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit.
Which is one of the reasons we get so distrustful, because we're distrustful of people. If people don't look, sound, agree with us, then we're already distrustful of them.
Yes.
So the idea that God might be speaking through them at a particular moment, or God might be giving them insight that is not characteristic of them at all, is hard for us. I've forgotten who we were talking about the other day, but we were talking about somebody who said something really profound, who we didn't like.
We're like, wait.
Wait, what?
They said that? Really?
Wait, really? But sometimes that's God.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I'm not saying every time it's God.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't mean you should then believe everything else they say.
No.
But every once in a while, that happens. And so you take that, or you hear it, you hear what they say in a way they didn't mean. Sometimes that's God, right? Saying, hey, I understand that what this person just said was completely foolish. However, here's a message that you can take from this.
Yeah.
Now God doesn't say all those words. I'm not God, so I'm not brief. but I think that's part of it, is becoming sensitive and humble about what you might listen to.
Yeah, for sure. Listeners, have you heard the voice of God? How do you discern when it's God and when it's not? We would love to hear from you. CocktailTheology.com is where we are. Please do follow or subscribe wherever you are listening right now. That helps other people find us. We appreciate that very much. Catch you next time.
Bye.